Okay, so here's the shutter. This is in the released position. And when the shutter's cocked, this would be rotated until it latches in position there. So it's caught on the catch here. This is cocked. It's ready to push this, which is connected to the blade actuating ring. And as this comes round, it would contact this speed train here, which was stuck back out of the way. It was stuck like that. It should be free. When we press the release, which is here, it pulls up this lever, frees this. This should spin round, push the blade actuating ring to the end of its travel, and as it rotates further, it pulls it back again. In the meantime, it's pushing our speed train across. Let's see what happens. Nothing's moving. The speed train wasn't having much influence there. Everything is just very gummed up. So I think, well, let's just take this thing apart. I'll clear my workspace. Alright, let's take this sandy mess to pieces. This little piece here can lift off. That piece's job is to stop you from being able to set the self-timer if the shutter is set to B. So if it's set to B, the self-timer would be ridiculous, really. That's no way that can possibly work. So I'll unhook this spring. Let's see if this self-timer will lift out. I'm just checking to see if there are any odd springs here that I'm not aware of. We'll see if we can get this spring unhooked. And it'll probably pull out this way. Yep, so there's that spring. The self-timer, if we rotate this slightly, we can bring a cutout round to this face against the shutter. I should be able to lift the self-timer out with a bit of luck. We're trapped by this catch here. I'll pull that catch back. We can lift the self-timer out. That will need to be very well flushed with naphtha, I'd say. This speed train is the retard gear train. That's what controls the speed of the shutter. So I'm just cocked the shutter to let this arm swing across to expose this fixing screw here. Take note of the shape of each of these screws that you take out so you don't mix them up. This one here is a tall post screw. This should free up this speed train. You need to pull that arm across to be able to swing this out. So that's out. That speed train will certainly need to be cleaned. Here we have our flash contact. This little arm is activated by the action here, and it swings across, hits this thing, which makes this flash contact. So we can take that piece off. And this consists of about 3 pieces. We've got these are all stuck together. Let's get these apart. I'm not sure why that screw should be like, yeah, that's better. So we have a brass shoulder screw, this piece, and a little standoff or barrel that sits underneath it. Take those out. Look at the state of the flash contact here. There's the flash contact loose in here. That's the moving flash contact. We can remove that from the body. This shutter's sitting there in the cocked position. This spring here, that's quite important. That's a detent that acts to return the blade actuating ring firmly to the closed position unless it's been acted upon by this spring. Now that's important because otherwise it'll drift slightly open and you'll find that light would be getting through the blades otherwise. So we can unhook that spring and remove it. It looks like that. If you don't unhook it now, it'll end up springing across the room at a later time and causing you grief. So I'm just looking to see if there's anything else I need to take into account here. This arm here is spring loaded. The spring in this case is on a post here, and it acts against a stud on the underside of this arm. And you can see the tail of the spring extending all the way down to this point. Be aware of that spring. It's easily damaged when you're pulling things apart or trying to get them back together or playing with the mechanism while it's apart, in which case things won't go well. So on the case here we've got that piece of sticky tape that was covering that port in the housing. We'll have to replace that with a new piece of tape when we put this back together. We don't need to take any of this stuff out in order to service the rest of the shutter. These levers, unless you're exceptionally unlucky, giving them a good flush with a bit of naphtha, blowing it out, and as long as they're moving smoothly, you don't need to do anything else to those. Now I've got a big wad of grease on the top of that thread there, so I don't want to stick that straight down here. I'll find a piece of paper. Okay, from the back of the shutter we have 4 screws in the case. If I rotate this ring round to the right position, it should expose all of those screws at once. I'm seeing 3 of them easily. 1, 2, 3. And the 4th is round there. Alright, so we'll just take that one out first, I think. These screws hold the mechanism plate into the shutter body. Now the screws are not all the same length. One of them is longer. And that's because it holds the tail end of that spring that we took out earlier. I was keeping a lot of downward pressure on that screw to stop the screwdriver from camming out. This is the longer of the screws. You can see its length there relative to its mate. So there we have the screws, 3 short ones, 1 long one. Now it's not hard to figure out where they go, so I'm not going to bother showing you that now. I want to lift the back of this shutter off now. You can see this is the piece, this is where the shutter cocks. And I don't think I can pull that pin through the back of the case, so I'm going to have to remove that pin. It looks like the pin is tapered. It probably comes out this way. It's not going to push out easily for me, but I've got a pair of pliers that'll do that job. Now usually you can just get by with a plain pair of pliers, and I'm just going to see if that'll do it for me. It's not doing anything useful in that direction at least. There we go. So I needed to pull the pin this way. It's very lightly tapered. Now let's get that pin the rest of the way out. Some of these pins are probably just parallel. They often have a little knurl in the middle. Okay, so we should be able to lift that case off there now. Let's see if that'll lift out. It's catching on something. Here we go, it's off. Okay, so it was catching on grease and rubbish really. See, here we have the mechanism plate. Let's get that paper out from behind there because it affects the exposure and I can't control that unfortunately. Okay, so we've got our 5 blades. Now take note of where those blades are situated. Normally what I do is take a very sharp tool and mark them. So I can see that this is the blade at the bottom, so I'll put make one mark there. This one sits on top of it, so 2. This one 3. This one 4. And this one 5. And those tiny marks that I've made, they just help me place those blades. It means I know where they're going to be put. Now the blades themselves, we can lift them off. These blades are probably identical, but I'm laying them out in order just in case they're not. Now here, the tail of this blade runs under a slot in this post, so you have to wiggle the thing up and out like that, otherwise you'll damage it. There's no corrosion or anything on those blades, just a little bit of oil. You can see a little spot of brightness here, here and here. That's oil. The retaining plate, the mechanism, now what am I saying? The blade actuating ring is this thing here, and as that rotates backwards and forwards, it swings those blades in and out. They're pivoted on those screw heads. Now the screw heads, they've got washers underneath them. And the washers are frequently different sizes. Now why that should be the case has never been entirely clear to me. But you can take the screws and the washers out. We want to remove this blade actuating ring to clean everything. Now here where the post is, there's a small washer there, and the washers are important. They go underneath the blade. And opposite it almost, there was the other small washer. The other 3 were larger washers. Now why? I don't know. I think sometimes it's just a bit random. What we can do without rolling greasy screws onto the glass. Okay, so see if I can pick that last washer up. Not today, it's not having it. That's better. Okay, so we've got nothing holding that blade actuating ring in now, except that it's being held by this lever. If we pull that back, the blade actuating ring will fall out. It did. There it is, just a plain piece of metal there, nothing exciting to see. Now underneath that, often there'll be a bit of grease or rubbish. That's all got to be cleaned away. We want this nice and clean. Got to be a bit judicious about splashing solvents around here because I don't want to get grease over that glass, because I don't really want to remove it from the shutter. I might have to. It might be more practical too, given the amount of grease and filth on here. And you can see this arm here. Frequently that'll just, yeah, it does. It just rolls back by itself. It's got to come back onto that spring. That spring has to hit this underside of this rivet. I've decided I will remove that glass lens. First I just want to get rid of some of that gross grease from around the inside of the lens tube, so I'm not dragging it out past that. Now that grease, when it began its life 60 years ago, was probably a nice pretty yellow or orange colour. Now it's just a filthy mess. Okay, so I'm going to have to find a tool to engage with these slots, and hopefully that lens is not glued in there. Even better if that lens is in a capsule which seats neatly. The worst case, it's sort of floating around in there and it's not going to be optically centered particularly well. I just don't know what to expect. So a tool to engage with those slots, well, that could be anything you happen to have that's handy. You've got to make sure that whatever you use doesn't come in contact with the glass. This spudge is no good because it's a bit too flimsy. That steel rule's no good because it doesn't span quite far enough. I have to find a proper tool. What about this? No, I couldn't get this one in there. That would work, but it's not today. This, which used to be some circlip pliers, but I've ground the tips away to suit me better. Let's try this. It's whether the tips will engage with the slots in there, because they're quite, yeah, it does. And that ring was not over tight, so it just needed to be poked and it was loose. So I can roll this out. Now I'm using a toothpick to do this here so I don't make a mess. That was just a retaining ring. And our glass is sitting in there. Now make sure I know which face goes where, I'm going to put a mark on that. It may be entirely clear because there may be a bevel on the back surface of that glass so you can tell which way it was installed, but there may not. I'm going to take a pen, a marker pen, and put a little dot on one corner so I know which was the front edge. Okay, so I'll just put a little dot there. I can clean that away with a bit of spirit or something later. Now let's just see if that lens will drop out for me. No, that'd be too easy. Let's push it out then. Yep, there it is. And it does have a bevel on the edge where it pushes into the shutter, so that would not be an impossible job to reseat that thing. That's good. And it means it locates neatly in that mount. So there was we don't have to worry about anything else. That was a good fit. Okay, so that basically what that does for me is it leaves me free now to splash as much solvent as I like around this mechanism plate to wash away residual grease that I haven't managed to wipe off yet, and any grit and dust and rubbish that's in there, because I really would like that all sparkly clean, because it's not at the moment. I'm not enthusiastic to take apart all these levers. I only do that when I absolutely need to, and the reason for that is just pretty simple basically. It's just awkward to get them all back together again. I can see that I've already popped a spring off its perch here, and I'm pretty sure that one went there. It's just, yeah, that one sat there. But they're easily dislodged, and if they come off completely, unless you've got pictures of exactly where they came from, and they're always tricky when they're in underneath other components, you end up with trouble. You just can't get things back to where they should be. There's something there, and it's just a thread of metal. It was just a loose piece of metal there. Just thinner than a hair. It's a shaving of some sort that's come off something else. It's a sort of nuisance that you can find in shutters. Okay, I'll clean around this with some solvent on a cotton bud. And I just want to move all of this crud that's on the outside. Now here we've got dried out grease, there's dust, this thread around the outside is where a retaining ring sat, and of course that was a fight to get that off. It's like spots of corrosion or something here. Those marks are not going to come off. That's okay. You can only get things as clean as you can get them. I'm just cleaning the inside of that mount. Now we come to the back of the mechanism plate, and I want all of this clean and free from any oil and grease. There's a fair bit of rubbish coming off on here. Then I'm going to pour some naphtha onto this mechanism and then use a blower to blow it all out and hopefully get rid of all of the grit and dust that's in there, which at the moment's been stuck there by the oil. Naphtha will loosen that stuff. And the alternative is you could probably use one of those magic spray cleaners like brake clean or something like that, but you know, be very cautious about that stuff. It could, you know, melt the paint or cause you some other problem. But if you happen to know that it'll work for you, that can be very good, things like that, for getting rid of oils and grease where you don't really need it. And when you do that and you blow it out afterwards, of course, if there's no oil or grease to stick grit and dust in place, it'll just blow away and the thing will be clean. Right, let me go and clean this plate. Alright, I've got that all cleaned to my satisfaction. That took very little time indeed. So we can think about putting the blade actuating ring back in place, which I've also cleaned. Now you can lubricate a blade actuating ring like that before you put it back in place if you so desire. Now, typically you can lubricate it with graphite powder, but you're likely to end up with graphite powder floating around loose with places you don't want it. So I've got a nice soft lead pencil here, and I'm just going to run some of that on that surface where this will run. Around the centre, that'll do nicely. And I'll run some around the inside edge of this, because sometimes these are a little bit rough. That'll do. Now, what we want to do is we've got to get this, the pin on this pin here needs to be coupled to this arm. I've got this in the cocked position. Pull this back, make sure that that spring is being, this spring here is behind the stud, it's pulling it into position. And I should be able to drop my blade actuating ring back into position. Now this is not dropping into place. I'm going to have to watch that. It may be that that spring lacks sufficient tension. Okay, so that's back in place now. It's just sitting there. Nothing's holding it in position. I've got my washers and screws. Now we had two small washers. One sat there. These screws are a little bit awkward to get placed. They are quite short. They've got almost no lead on them, so they don't start easily. And of course they're going into aluminium, which is relatively soft, and you can mess those threads up. That one went in very nicely. The other small washer went over here. I can pick this thing up. Now my tweezers need some attention, I think, because I'm having trouble getting that thing to pick up. That's better. And that went over here. You want to be careful with these screws, because if the heads get damaged when you're trying to screw them in, then the blades might not rotate smoothly around the head of the screw. It's one of these jobs where it'd be handy to be very ambidextrous. Because here I'm using the screwdriver in my left hand to get that started, and I'm not left-handed. These screws should all be the same length if you're very lucky. That screw didn't really want to start nicely. That's why I had to back it up once or twice until it's seated correctly. As I say, they're very short, and the aluminium shutter body mechanism plate is quite thin. One last screw and then they're done. Lucky these screws are great big things. Wouldn't want to be a watchmaker. Okay, they're all in place. Now if we release the shutter, does that mechanism work? It certainly appears to. That spring popped off there. Might lack sufficient tension. Okay, I think we could fit some blades. Well, that mechanism plate's nice and clean now. That's all ready for reassembly. Just got to clean the shutter blades before we put that back in, but of course we haven't done anything with this. Now looking at this, the glass is quite dirty in that lens in the back, but I think I can leave it in place. So the setting lever here for the diaphragm, I can see a lot of dirt and grease and rubbish in around that. And the blades have got some marks on them right there, and I can't tell whether they're scuff marks or grease marks really. Let's give that a little wipe with a bit of naphtha and find out. A little bit of grease, I think. So the diaphragm would certainly benefit from coming apart, cleaning everything, put it back together. So these are always fun and games. Our setting lever is held to the control ring with 2 screws there, which we should be able to access through holes in the cover plate here and here. So that means I can take that setting lever off. Let's do that. And I'll just recover those 2 screws before they get lost. Here they go, 2 shoulder screws. This ring you can see is dusty and dirty, there's a bit of sand and rubbish on that, and you see the back of the case, there's a lot of filth on there too. That certainly needs to come off. Okay, so now let's take this plate off. It's held in here with a single screw. Sometimes these shutters have 2 screws holding that plate in place. Now take note of the direction that the blades are sitting in. Take note of the position of this plate. What I'm using for alignment here is this big round hole here lines up with the round hole in the case that this will come through. Near the round hole there's this cutout. This cutout is to clear the flash contact here, so it only goes in that position. This is quite oily looking, but I'm not sure whether that coloration may be oil or maybe not. Here we have the settings ring, and that's got the blade sitting on it at the moment. And here's the case. Let's just pop that to one side and deal with the case. I think you can see the sand and the grease and the filth that's in there. All that's got to come out, and I will clean that glass before I start reassembling anything.